where does the power of government truly come from? Is it, some mystical inherited right?
We're just whoever happens to be strongest.
Exactly. Or is it something that we, the people, actually create and agree to? These aren't just dusty old questions, are they? They feel fundamental.
They really are. They shape how we think about society, our rights, our freedoms, even today.
And maybe no one tackled these questions more profoundly or laid out a more influential framework for answering them than John Locke.
Definitely. In his, groundbreaking work, The Second Treatise of Government.
Absolutely. It's a text that, honestly, even centuries later, feels incredibly relevant. It just systematically builds this case for individual liberty.
And for limited government, crucially, based on the consent of the government.
Right. So for this deep dive, that's what we want to unpack. We're looking directly at excerpts from the treatise itself. Plus, we've got some important context on its historical setting, thinking particularly about the Glorious Revolution.
Which was happening right around the time he was writing, or at least publishing.
Yeah, an analysis of his key ideas. Natural law, property, equality. What makes government legitimate?
So our mission here isn't just a summary. We want to really distill the core insights, those aha moments you get from reading Locke.
Tracing his logical steps, right? Starting from that hypothetical state of nature he imagines.
All the way through justifying property, why we form governments, what limits they should have.
And even, controversially, when people have the right to overthrow a government that goes wrong.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. So let's get started. We'll follow Locke's path beginning right at the beginning, his thought experiment about humanity before government, the state of nature.
Right. And it's important, I think, to stress what he's doing here. He isn't trying to give us like an anthropological history lesson about early humans.
It's more of a philosophical tool.
Exactly. A hypothetical starting point to figure out the baseline condition. What are humans like naturally? And Locke describes it, this is in section 5, as a state of perfect equality.
Perfect equality. What does he mean by that?
He means no one naturally has superiority or jurisdiction over anyone else. By nature, we're all on the same level. No divine right of kings baked in from the start.
Okay.
He even pulls in Richard Hooker, a respected theologian who apparently saw this fundamental equality of men by nature. Locke quotes this in section 5 as the basis for our obligation to mutual love amongst men.
So equality leads to a kind of mutual respect or duty.
Yeah, leading to principles like justice and charity. It's quite a positive starting point, actually.
It really is. And that equality idea immediately sets him apart from, from other big names thinking about this stuff at the time.
You mean Hobbes?
Yeah, exactly. When you hear state of nature, you often think of Thomas Hobbes and his famous description of life there being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A war of all against all.
Right. And while some analysis points out similarities in how they see basic human drives, appetites, aversions, Locke's vision of the state of nature is radically different.
How so?
Well, he explicitly argues against it being necessarily a state of war. Section 19 is super clear on this. Locke says the state of nature, initially at least, is not war. It's a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation.
Okay, that's a world away from Hobbes.
It really is. For Locke, the state of war is something specific that happens later. It arises when someone uses force or a declared design of force upon the person of another where there is no common superior to appeal to.
So it's a breakdown, not the default setting.
Exactly, a perversion of the natural state. He says in section 19 they are as far distant as a state of peace and a state of enmity. This is crucial. The problem for Locke isn't that humans are inherently monsters. It's that the state of nature, despite its peace and equality, lacks the mechanisms to reliably stop conflict once it starts, or to justly resolve disputes.
Okay, so if it's a state of peace and equality governed by reason, but there's no government, no written laws, how do people know how to act? What guides them?
That's where natural law comes in. This is the governing principle. It's not legislation passed by Parliament.
Right.
It's something discoverable by human reason itself. One of the sources puts it nicely. We figure it out not because it's like hardwired from birth, but by the use and due application of our natural faculties. It's knowable by the light of nature.
So it's like a universal moral code accessible through thinking.
Pretty much. And it dictates fundamental rules for how we should interact. Essential for mutual security, as Section 8 puts it.
What kind of rule?
Well, the core obligation, mentioned in Section 6, is to preserve the rest of mankind whenever our own survival isn't threatened. We shouldn't harm others in their life, health, liberty, or possessions.
That sounds familiar.
It's foundational. It also requires doing justice. He brings Hooker back in Section 5, saying reason teaches us it's our duty to love others than themselves because equal things need one measure. So natural law is like God's measure, setting the rules for our mutual security. That's 8.
And this applies even if people haven't formally agreed to anything.
Yes, that's key. Locke argues in Section 15 it's binding even without any settled fellowship or explicit agreements. It's the inherent moral fabric of human relations, discoverable by reason.
And from this natural law, we get natural rights.
Exactly. They flow directly from it. The sources really stress natural freedom as a key right. Section 22 defines this.
But not freedom to do just anything.
No, not license. It's freedom from arbitrary power. Freedom from any superior power on earth being subject only the law of nature for his rule.
Okay.
And this freedom is tightly linked to self-preservation. It's like a protective fence, as Section 17 calls it, against being enslaved or destroyed.
So freedom is essential for protecting your life.
Yes. And while the famous triad life, liberty, and property is central to his whole argument, this fundamental freedom from arbitrary control is paramount. It's so basic that, as he argues later in Section 149, you can't even voluntarily give it up. You can't consent to absolute slavery because you can't give someone else the power to destroy you, which is ultimately what absolute power entails.
So these rights are inalienable. You can't give them away or have them legitimately taken.
That's the idea. They're rooted in natural law and necessary for our very being.
Okay, so we have this state of nature. Equality, initial peace, governed by natural law, discoverable by reason, giving rise to inalienable rights like life, liberty, and the means to preserve them. But what happens if someone breaks that natural law? If someone attacks me or steals my stuff? Who enforces the rules?
Now we get to the crux of the problem, the inconvenience, as Locke calls it. In the state of nature, he says, every single individual has the executive power of the law of nature.
Every single person.
Every single person. Section 8 is explicit. Every man upon this score, by the right he hath to preserve mankind in general, may bring such evil on anyone who hath transgressed that law as may make him repent, and thereby deter him, and by his example others.
Wow.
It goes on. Every man hath a right to punish the offender and be executioner of the law of nature.
So I get to be judge, jury, and executioner if someone wrongs me.
In the state of nature, yes. Locke does say the punishment should be guided by calm reason and conscience, aiming only for reparation, making amends, and restraint, deterrence.
But still, that sounds problematic.
It's hugely problematic, and Locke knows it. This is the core inconvenience he identifies in Section 90. The sources point squarely at the issue, men being judge in his own case.
Because we're biased.
Of course. Self-love, passion, revenge, these things inevitably cloud judgment. You're unlikely to be fair when punishing someone who hurt you or stole from you.
Right. You might go too far, or maybe not far enough if it's your friend.
Exactly. It makes enforcing natural law inconsistent, potentially excessive, and deeply unstable. Section 19 highlights that the wantas, a common superior on earth, with authority to judge between them, is what makes the state of war a constant risk and makes rights fundamentally insecure.
So the rights exist on paper, so to speak, based on natural law.
But actually protecting them is unreliable and dangerous because enforcement is left to every individual's potentially biased judgment.
I can see how that would quickly become unbearable. It sounds like a system ripe for escalating feuds and violence, even if it started peacefully.
Precisely. Even if the law is clear, through reason, the enforcement is flawed. And this deep insecurity is the major motivation for people wanting to leave the state of nature and create something else.
Okay, that makes sense. But before we jump to the something else, the government Locke introduces another absolutely massive idea within the state of nature: property.
Yes.
Crucial.
If everything starts out common, belonging to everyone, how does anyone get the right to own something individually? Especially before there are governments and laws to define ownership.
This is arguably Locke's most famous and perhaps most influential contribution. It's central to his whole philosophy. He makes the pretty radical claim for his time that private property rights exist before government. They aren't created by government.
Okay, how does that work? Where do they come from? He starts with the most fundamental ownership, owning yourself. Section 44 says, though the things of nature are given in common, yet man, by being master of himself and proprietor of his own person, and the actions or labor of it, had still in himself the great foundation of property.
So, step one, you own you, and you own your actions, your labor.
Exactly. That's undeniable, he thinks. Your body, your effort, that's yours.
Okay. But how does that let me own, say, an apple I pick from a wild tree? Or the land I clear and farm? The apple and the land weren't originally me.
This is the clever part, the labor theory of property.
Yeah.
Locke argues that when you take something out of the common state it's in,
Like the apple on the tree.
and you manure labor with it, labor which is undeniably yours, you join something of yourself to it. By doing that, you remove it from the common state and make it your property.
Let's use these examples. They're pretty clear in the sources.
Good idea. Section 28 uses the apple example. The apples hanging there are common to all, but the act of picking them requires your labor. He says, the labor that was mine, removing them out of that common state they were in, hath fixed my property in them.
The picking makes them mine.
Yes. Or, Section 29 gives other examples. Cutting firewood. The trees are common, but the labor of cutting makes the wood yours. Digging ore out of the ground.
Right.
Even just drawing water from a river into your pitcher. The water in the river is common, but the labor of scooping it up makes the water in your pitcher yours. The act of applying your personal effort is what establishes the initial right.
That's a really powerful and sort of intuitive idea. It connects ownership directly to effort and creation. But were there limits? Could someone in this early state just run around, tap in every tree, and claim all the apples?
Yeah.
Or fence off a whole continent?
Locke did see initial limits, especially in the early stages before money complicated things. These limits are tied to the principles of use and sufficiency.
Use and sufficiency.
Yeah. The sources imply this strongly. Section 45 mentions that early on, people contented themselves with what unassisted nature offered to their necessities. You should only take as much as you could actually use before it's spoiled.
Ah, the spoilage limit. So hoarding piles of apples that just rot wouldn't be legitimate.
Exactly. Letting things spoil wastes the common stock and harms others. And the other implied limit is often called the enough and as good proviso. When you take something from the common stock, you should leave enough and as good quality for others.
So don't take the last apple from the only tree, basically.
Right. This was feasible, Locke thought, when populations were small and resources, especially land, were abundant. Section 45 talks about land becoming scarce later, implying it wasn't initially. The idea of unused wasteland being common reinforces this property was tied to active use and improvement and leaving opportunities for others.
Okay, so initially,
Yeah.
take what you can use, leave enough for others, seems reasonable, but that's obviously not the world we live in now, with vast accumulations of wealth and property.
Yeah.
What changed?
Money. According to Locke, the invention, and crucially the acceptance of money, fundamentally changed the game.
How did money change those limits?
Think about it. Apples spoil. Land can only be worked so much by one person. But money, gold, and silver in Locke's day doesn't spoil. Section 45 points out money is some lasting thing that men might keep without spoiling.
Right.
And, critically, people agreed to give it value. They consented to use it as a medium of exchange. Because you can accumulate money without it spoiling, it allows people to represent and store the value of their labor or the products of their labor beyond what they can personally use immediately.
Ah, so I can sell the extra apples I pick for money and the money doesn't rot.
Exactly. And because everyone agrees money has value, you can accumulate it. This bypasses the spoilage limitation. And because money allows for trade and larger scale enterprise, it incentivizes producing more than you need for immediate use.
And this leads to greater inequality.
It enables it, yes. Section 45 explicitly links the use of money to land becoming scarce and so of some value. Once money exists and is accepted, people have a reason to claim and cultivate more land than they strictly need for subsistence because they can sell the surplus. And Locke argues that by agreeing to the use of money, people have implicitly consented to this unequal distribution of property.
That's a big step. Consent to money equals consent to inequality.
That seems to be his argument. Section 45 suggests that only where people haven't consented to the use of their common money does land still lie common and unappropriated on a large scale. The agreement to use money effectively validates larger unequal holdings acquired through labor and trade.
Wow. Okay. So we have the inconveniencies of the state of nature, that lack of impartial justice making life insecure.
Right.
And we have the development of property, initially limited, but then expanded and made unequal through the consent to use money, potentially leading to more disputes over resources.
Exactly. Both factors push people towards wanting a more stable system.
So this provides the motivation to leave the state of nature and form a political society.
That's the core of Locke's social contract argument. It's not necessarily that the state of nature is always a brutal war, like Hobbes thought.
Right, you said Locke saw it as initially peaceful.
Yes, but it's inherently unstable. It lacks reliable mechanisms for protecting rights and resolving conflicts fairly. Section 90 says people unite to avoid and remedy those inconveniences. The big problems are the lack of a known, settled law everyone agrees on.
Okay.
The lack of an impartial judge to apply the law.
The bias problem again.
Right, and the lack of a reliable power to enforce the judge's decisions. Section 90 sums it up. They need a known authority to which everyone may appeal.
And the main goal, the driving purpose behind creating this authority, this government.
Section 94 is crystal clear. The great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property.
And remembering property for Locke is broad.
Very broad. It means life, liberty, and estate. So the fundamental purpose of government is to better protect the natural rights people already possess but can't reliably secure in the state of nature.
Okay. And how does this happen? How is this government, this political society, formed legitimately? Does the strongest person just take over?
Absolutely not, according to Locke. Conquest doesn't create right. Divine right is out. The only legitimate basis for political power is the consent of the governed.
Consent.
Yes. Since people are naturally free and equal, Section 95 implies, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without their own agreement. People have to voluntarily agree to join together into a community.
How does that work? Does everyone need to sign a contract?
Locke talks about two kinds of consent. There's express consent, actively, explicitly agreeing to be part of a society, like formally joining or taking an oath. Section 45 mentions compact and agreement, settling property bounds, which sounds like express consent.
Okay, that's straightforward enough. What's the other kind?
Tacit consent. This is implied consent. Locke suggests that if you live within a territory, enjoy the protection of its laws, own property there, or generally benefit from the society.
You're implicitly agreeing to abide by its rules.
That's the idea. Section 94 mentions governments might initially form by tacit consent to a leader, which holds as long as property is secure. And the whole discussion in Section 45 about consenting to money and the resulting property structures implies this kind of ongoing tacit agreement by participating in the system. If you benefit, you consent, and you're bound.
That seems potentially tricky. What if you don't feel like you consented?
That's a critique often raised, but for Locke, remaining and enjoying the benefits constitutes tacit consent. The alternative is to leave, theoretically.
Okay, so people consent, expressly or tacitly, to form a society. What do they actually give up in this deal, this social contract?
They primarily give up that individual executive power of the law of nature. Remember, the right everyone had to judge and punish offenses themselves.
Right, the power that caused all the inconvenience.
Exactly. They resign that power to the community, or to the government the community sets up, Section 89. They agree to let the established laws and impartial judges handle it.
And what do they gain in return for giving up that power?
Security, stability, predictability. They gain the benefit of established known laws, Section 87. They get an impartial judge to settle disputes, Section 89. And crucially, they get the collective force of the whole community to enforce those laws and protect their rights, their life, liberty, and property far more effectively than they ever could individually, Section 89.
So it's a trade. Give up individual enforcement power for collective security and impartial justice.
That's the essence of the bargain. You gain much more security for your fundamental rights than you lose in personal power.
This brings us to the nature of the government itself. Locke was obviously not a fan of absolute power. He argues strongly for limited government.
Absolutely central to his thinking. The government they create isn't meant to be all-powerful. It's created for specific purposes, and its power is limited by those purposes.
How are those limits defined?
The government holds power in trust. It's a fiduciary power, as Section 149 puts it, acting for certain ends. It can't just do whatever it wants.
What are the key boundaries?
Well, first, it must govern by promulgated established laws, not by arbitrary decrees or whims. That's 142. The laws have to be known and stable.
And apply to everyone equally.
Yes. Section 142 insists on one rule for rich and poor, no special exemptions for the powerful. Second, the laws must be designed only for the good of the people, Section 142. That's their ultimate justification.
Okay. Laws must be stable, equal, and for the public good. What about property? That was the main reason for forming government.
Exactly. So a crucial limit emphasized in Section 138 and implied throughout is that government cannot take property without consent. Since protecting property is the government's main job, it can't arbitrarily seize it. Taxation, for instance, requires consent, usually through representatives.
Makes sense. Any other major limits?
The legislative power, even though it's supreme within the government, must act consistently with its purpose, the preservation of the community, Section 149. It can't destroy what it was created to protect. And while not explicitly detailed in the provided excerpts here, a standard Lockean point is that the legislature cannot transfer its lawmaking power to anyone else. The people gave that power specifically to them.
So the power is delegated, held in trust, and strictly limited by its purpose and by fundamental rights. He also talks about structuring the government internally to prevent abuse, the separation of powers.
Yes, another incredibly influential idea. He identifies three main governmental powers in sections 143 to 146.
Let's quickly outline them.
First, the legislative power. This is the authority to make the laws, to decide how the force of the Commonwealth shall be employed. Section 143. Locke suggests it's best placed in an assembly, like a parliament.
Why an assembly?
Section 143 suggests it's good if the lawmakers are also subject to the laws they make. It keeps them honest, focus on the public good, not just their own advantage. He also notes the legislature doesn't need to be constantly active. Laws can be made periodically.
Okay, legislative makes the laws. Then?
The executive power. Section 144 describes this as the power to enforce the laws domestically. This power, unlike the legislative, needs to be constantly working, always in being, Section 143, because laws need continuous enforcement.
Makes sense. And the third one, federative.
Right, the federative power. This one deals with external affairs, what Section 145 calls the management of the security and interest of the public without. So war, peace, treaties, alliances with other states, Section 146.
Handling foreign policy, basically.
Exactly. Locke notes in Section 146 that this power is often held by the same people who hold the executive power, since both involve wielding the community's force, just directed differently, internally versus externally.
So legislative, executive, federative. Which one does he think is the most important, the supreme power within this structure?
He's clear in Section 149 that the legislative is the supreme power within the government. All other powers are subordinate to it.
But you said earlier the people retain ultimate power.
Exactly. This is the crucial qualification. The legislative is supreme within the government structure, but it's still only a fiduciary power. Section 149 immediately adds that the ultimate supreme power remains still in the people. The people delegate power to the legislature, but they can take it back if the trust is broken.
And why is separating these powers, especially legislative and executive, so important for stopping tyranny?
It's a practical safeguard against the abuse of power. Section 143 points out the temptation. If the same people who make the laws also enforce them, they might make laws that benefit themselves or exempt themselves from obeying.
Power corrupts, basically.
That's the underlying idea. Separating the powers creates checks and balances. Different bodies, different people, different functions. It makes it harder for any one entity to grab absolute control. This directly counters absolute monarchy, which Locke slams in sections 90 and 91 as inconsistent with civil society.
Why inconsistent?
Because the absolute monarch isn't subject to the law. He remains in a state of nature relative to his subjects. They have no impartial judge or authority to appeal to if the monarch violates their rights. They're subject to his arbitrary will, the very thing government was supposed to fix.
This leads us right into maybe Locke's most radical idea, certainly for his time, the right of the people to resist their government, even to overthrow it.
The right to revolution, yes. It's the ultimate consequence of his theory of government by consent and limited fiduciary power.
So when is this justified? When can the people legitimately fight back?
It's justified when the government breaks the trust placed in it. Section 149 says this happens whenever that end, the preservation of the community, is manifestly neglected or opposed. When the government stops protecting rights and starts violating them.
Can we get more specific? What kind of actions trigger this right now?
The sources give several examples. A big one is altering the legislative power without authority. Section 155 says, if the executive tries to stop the legislature from meeting and doing its job, that puts the executive in a state of war with the people, who can then use force to restore their legislature.
So messing with the representative body is a major breach.
A huge one. Also, if the rulers actively design or go about to enslave or destroy the people, that's 168.
Yeah.
Or when the government invades the liberties and properties of the subject, section 149. Using force without authority, 155, is another trigger.
What about external threats?
Section 220 mentions if the government is delivered over to a foreign power, that also dissolves the government and returns power to the people. Basically, any fundamental betrayal of the purpose for which government was created justifies resistance.
And this is what he calls the appeal to heaven.
Yes. Sections 21 and 168 use that phrase. When there's no judge on earth left to appeal to because the government itself is the one violating the law, and trust the people have only recourse to force, appealing to God or their own conscience, as Section 21 puts it, as the ultimate judge of whether their cause is just.
It's a powerful idea. And it's about dissolving the government, not society itself.
Okay. That's an important distinction. Society, the community of people agreed to live together, might remain. It's the specific governing structure that dissolves when it acts against its trust. Section 220 says when this happens, the people are free to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative, as they shall find it most for their safety and good. They get to rebuild.
Why is this right to revolution so critical in Locke's view? Why include something so potentially disruptive?
Because it's the ultimate guarantor of liberty. It's the people's final power to preserve what they have not a power to part with, Section 49, their inalienable rights. Without this final check, people could be forced into tyranny with no recourse. Section 220 argues it's necessary not just to escape tyranny once you're under it, but to prevent it by resisting the steps that lead there. It ensures the government remains accountable.
Okay, moving to another area where Locke draws careful distinctions. He talks a lot about paternal power versus political power. Why was this distinction so important to him?
It was absolutely vital for dismantling arguments for absolute monarchy based on the idea that a king's power is like a father's power. Thinkers like Sir Robert Filmer had argued this, effectively deriving political authority from paternal authority. Locke needed to show they are fundamentally different things.
So how did he define paternal power?
Paternal power is the power parents have over their children. Section 174 says it applies specifically where minority makes the child incapable to manage his property. It's temporary, based on the child's lack of reason and dependence. Section 55, it's meant for the child's care, education, and protection.
And it ends.
Yes, it ceases when the child reaches the years of discretion, becomes a rational adult capable of managing their own life and property. Section 55, Section 66, Section 74. Adults owe parents honor, respect, maybe support, but parents don't retain political power over their adult children. They can't make laws for them or control their liberty or property.
And how is political power totally different?
Political power is power exercised over free, equal, rational adults. People capable of managing their own affairs, property in their own disposal, Section 74. And crucially, its only legitimate source is the consent of those governed, not birth, not fatherhood agreement. Making this distinction, as Section 90 implies, demolishes the justification for absolute monarchy based on paternal right. It shows the king isn't ruling consenting adults as a father, but potentially as a despot.
Now, we also have to touch on Locke's views on slavery. These are, well, complicated and pretty controversial today.
They are indeed. And it's important to look closely at what the sources say, he argued, acknowledging the deep historical ironies and criticisms. Generally, Locke condemns absolute arbitrary slavery.
How so?
Section 17 frames attempting to gain absolute arbitrary power over someone as putting yourself in a state of war with them. It's a direct threat to their preservation, their fundamental liberty, Section 22. Natural freedom means not being under such arbitrary power.
So the kind of chattel slavery developing at the time would seem illegitimate under his basic principles.
Based purely on the principles of natural freedom and consent, yes, it seems hard to justify. However, Locke introduces a specific narrow exception where he argues a form of servitude could be legitimate.
An exception.
Yes. He argues that someone who has forfeited their own life by his fault, by some act that deserves death, and the main example given is starting an unjust war, can be enslaved by the person they wronged in that just war.
So captives in a just war.
Specifically, those who are the aggressors in an unjust war. Section 178 says the victor in a just war gains absolute power over the lives of those who by an unjust war have forfeited them. The victor could kill them, but Section 23 suggests they might choose instead to delay that and make use of him to his own service. This servitude arises from a forfeiture of life through a capital crime, like unjust aggression, not from nature or simple capture.
So it's tied to this idea of forfeiture through aggression.
That's the specific justification offered. Section 24 tries to distinguish this from other forms of servitude, like temporary drudgery where masters didn't have power over life. The sources also note this directly opposes Aristotle's idea of natural slavery, that some people are born to be slaves. And apparently Locke excludes these slaves by forfeiture from being property in the same sense as objects.
It's still a very uncomfortable argument given the context of the slave trade Locke himself had some involvement with.
Absolutely. It highlights a deep tension or perhaps inconsistency in his thought, or at least the problematic application of his abstract principles. It's a part of his legacy that requires critical examination.
Definitely. So, pulling back again, let's think about the overall impact. Why is the second treatise seen as such a cornerstone, such a foundational text?
Because it provides such a systematic, reasoned argument for so many ideas that became central to Western political thought. It's a bedrock text for classical liberalism and democratic theory.
What are the key takeaways that made it so influential?
The powerful case for inherent natural rights that governments exist to protect, not grant. The principle that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the governed. The necessity of limiting government power through constitutions, laws, and structures, like the separation of powers. And of course, the ultimate right of the people to resist tyranny. It provides, as one source said, a positive teaching on the true, original extent and end of civil government.
And we can see its influence in actual historical events.
Clearly. The sources linked it directly to the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. Locke's work essentially provided the philosophical justification after the fact for why it was okay to remove James II and install William and Mary.
How so?
By arguing James II had broken the trust ruled arbitrarily, threatened liberties and property, interfered with Parliament, he had effectively dissolved the government and forfeited his right to rule, returning power to the people, represented by Parliament in this context, to establish a new arrangement. The source describing William's landing, James's flight, and Parliament's actions fits perfectly with Locke's framework.
And then across the Atlantic.
The American Revolution. Its influence there is undeniable, even if scholars debate the exact extent compared to other ideas. The Declaration of Independence reads like a Lockean document in many ways.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Echoing Locke's life, liberty, and estate. The whole preamble about governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and the right of the people to alter or abolish a government that becomes destructive of these ends, that's pure Locke.
And the U.S. Constitution, too.
Yes. The emphasis on limited government, the separation of powers, checks and balances, these all reflect Lockean principles designed to prevent the concentration of arbitrary power.
It's amazing how durable these ideas have been. Are they still relevant in our debates today?
Absolutely. Constantly. Think about ongoing debates about human rights globally. What are they? Are they universal? That's a Lockean echo.
Well,
Debates about the size and scope of government, how much power should the state have? When does regulation become an infringement on liberty or property? That's a core Lockean tension.
property rights, too, I imagine.
Definitely. Questions about economic inequality, intellectual property, environmental resources, they often circle back to foundational ideas about how property is justified and what limits might exist. And of course, questions about political legitimacy, dissent, civil disobedience, protest, when is it justified to resist state authority? Locke provides a classic framework for thinking about that.
So his concepts are still very much alive in philosophy and political discourse.
For sure. Contemporary philosophers still engage with his ideas on natural law, consent, rights, and resistance. He set the terms for so much of the conversation we're still having.
It's been quite a journey through his arguments in this deep dive, from that starting point in the state of nature, with equality and natural law,
Through the justification of property via labor, then complicated by money and consent.
to the reasons for forming government by consent, namely security for life, liberty, and property.
Outlining a government that's limited, structured with separated powers, holding power only in trust.
And culminating in that ultimate safety valve, the people's right to take back power if the government fundamentally betrays that trust.
It's a remarkably coherent and powerful system he built. It really laid the groundwork for modern ideas about individual rights and accountable government.
It really did. And it leaves us and you with something to think about. Locke argued that the initial natural limits on acquiring property, taking only what you can use, leaving enough for others, were significantly altered by the invention and, crucially, the common consent to the use of money. This consent, he argued, implicitly justified the greater accumulation and inequality that followed. So here's the question. In our incredibly complex, globalized world today, with vast wealth inequalities, digital assets, finite resources, and financial systems that seem worlds away from mixing labor with apples. Does Locke's framework for property, rooted in labor but radically expanded by this idea of consent to money, still provide a solid moral or practical basis for thinking about economic justice? Or has the system evolved so far beyond what Locke envisioned that the consequences of that initial consent to money now pose fundamental challenges to fairness and equality that his 17th century theory struggles to adequately address? Something to ponder.